G'day and welcome to another episode of CTO Lifeline, the show that's dedicated to helping CTOs thrive. I'm co-host Daniel Walters, and with me is my fellow co-host Noah Cantor. All right. Hey Noah, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How's it going?
Good. I'm really excited to talk about today's theme, which is all focused around talent. So what are companies getting wrong when it comes to hiring? What are they getting right? But before we get into that, no, we've got some housekeeping.
Hey, everybody. If you enjoy what we do, please like and subscribe. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, a question you'd like us to answer, or if something we said has been particularly helpful, please leave a comment below telling us all about it. We love hearing from you. It helps keep the show focused on what our listeners need.
Excellent. So Noah, we've talked a bit over the whole time that we've done this live stream about talent from various aspects. And this was part of what motivated having a dedicated episode, no guest, or the audience can be a guest, so we could focus on this important topic. So tell me why it's important to you.
My experience over the course of my career, both as someone who's trying to hire and as someone who's been looking for a job at various points, has been that the hiring process has been incredibly painful. It's hard to keep up with all the applicants. It's also hard to find jobs that are in some way differentiated from other jobs when the skill sets all seem to be the same, the titles seem to be the same. How do you know which job is going to be the right one for you? How do you find the right company? How do you talk to people and learn whether or not the advertising that's being done actually matches what you're trying to find? And on the other side, how do you write advertisements and how do you interview and how do you hire so that you're not constantly swamped, so that you're not seeing it as a million applicants that you have to erect as many hurdles as necessary in order to limit the pool down to some human manageable number? And we see quite a lot of that going on at the moment, and it's escalating with the introduction of AI on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, and in addition to finding the connection with the right people through the advertising, there's also all these other strategies of how do you stay in contact with people that may be relevant. So yeah, there's lots of trends within the hiring space and lots of experience that both Noah and I have had in terms of attracting the right talent that we'll share with you across this episode. You mentioned the experience from the candidate side, Noah, which resonates strongly with me. It's something that I feel has informed a lot of the approach I've taken as a leader when hiring, is to remember all of those experiences when I was looking for work, whether it was recent experiences or going all the way through to my very first job hunts, yeah, straight out of university or even
Yeah.
whilst I was at university. Have you got any experiences as a candidate, whether going all the way back into the archives or recently, that you'd like to share?
As a candidate, what strikes me is the kind of implicit or assumed or generally accepted power differential. There's this idea as a candidate that you will jump through whatever hoops the company puts in front of you, and the more hoops a candidate is willing to jump through, the more suitable they are to your organization. But as a candidate, when I come and work for a company, I'm not planning on jumping through hoops. I'm aiming to be valuable, to use the skills that I've had and I've developed over years to help the company get where it needs to go. And so when I see those barriers erected, that doesn't encourage me to apply. It doesn't encourage me to jump through them. It makes me wary of the actual company. If this is the experience I'm going to have just trying to get in the door, what's it going to be like when I actually start working there? And so the way that we choose to filter people, or the way that most companies choose to filter people, is inherently off-putting to a part of the population that would be really good at actually doing the work and would actually be great in your team. But because of how we limit our pool to something that we can actually wrap our heads around, we often miss out on them. So as a candidate, I've seen quite a lot of that, and I've walked away from jobs and potential jobs because of those exact barriers, despite having been encouraged often by people in those companies, you should come work here. This would be great for you. You'd love it. They'd really benefit from having you. even under those circumstances, it's not enough.
I think of a principle that I often use as a CTO in terms of how things work within the business, which is to be wary of optimizing for your own convenience. And I often see evidence of that same optimizing for their own convenience in the recruitment process. Oh, we've got this localized problem. Maybe it's, oh, there's too many candidates or things like that. And
Yeah.
it's trying to solve it in a way that's convenient for them, but maybe not optimum for the best overall result. And so that would be a big signal that if it's like that on the way in, it's probably like that on the inside as well.
And the struggle, I think, is a lot of the time as a CTO, as someone who's doing the hiring, so on the other side, that's not actually what I'm looking for. Those are the kinds of tools that we are generally exposed to. You put up barriers, you put up additional interviews, you put up coding tests if you're hiring for software developers, you put up various exercises, or in some cases, they do personality tests or a variety of different, there's just so many different tools that get used, all as a way to make my life as the hiring manager smoother, as you said, more optimized. But I think it's actually based on a flawed set of assumptions that lead us down that path in a way that's really hard to either see or get out of.
Mm. I've seen some positive examples with some of these tools, which they weren't being used as a filter. They were used as to identify conversations as part of the hiring process. I don't think we're saying that all these potential tools are bad in their own respect, but it's more like how you put them to use. One example, when I was in the hiring process for the CTO and CIO role, they had a step which was testing some of your numeracy. It wasn't
Yeah.
set up to be the most difficult test, and it wasn't going to be exclusionary on you got this number and that you're a discount or anything like that, but identified some areas that were useful for conversation. And by the end of the interview, I was obviously I got the job, so I was obviously successful. But there were some areas that, like across the hiring process, here's some things where you really excelled at, and here's a couple of things that you could work on that will enable you to be more successful in the role. And yeah, it's just so interesting how a small adjustment can get a better result.
Yeah, absolutely.
What might a CTO be experiencing that leads them to be thinking about their approach for attracting and retaining talent?
I think a large part of the struggle is that at the time that CTOs are hiring, they're already swamped. They wait until there's too much work on their plate to actually get through. They wait until their teams can't actually do what needs to be done. And so they're sitting in this position of effective desperation, trying to find someone who's going to come in and help them. And often they're the ones who are covering for any of the gaps in the team, which means they are immediately incentivized to optimize for themselves. So that's the first challenge is don't try to think about how you hire and who you hire. Make sure all of that's in place in advance. So make sure even one of the first things you do when you start an organization is when you're still, before you're dragged into all the day-to-day stuff, is think about how you want to bring people in. What kind of reputation do you want your company to have on an outward basis? What are the things that are important so that when it comes time to actually do the hiring, you're not trying to solve that problem at the same time as bringing somebody in?
Yeah, so it's almost an extension of a lot of the themes that we've carried across CTO Lifeline, all the episodes, which is rather than be reactive, that is to be proactive in your thinking. Yeah, so don't wait for it to be completely on fire. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions.
I think we'll come back to them because I think they're really interesting. They're localized for us, but there will be a better time to talk about them.
Yeah, in a few minutes. We'll get to those in a few minutes, Mark, because we're setting the scene on a couple of things. So we got into this question of talent and CTOs. Maybe if we step out just even a bit broader, when we think of the impact a CTO can make, where does talent fit in?
All the way at the top. I don't think there's anything more important for any organization than hiring. Hire the right people who fit well into your organization, who are going to challenge it in the right ways, who are going to push the culture to expand and change in the right ways. Those people are invaluable. And if you get that wrong, you're going to struggle. And so treating hiring as a necessary evil, which I've seen done, treating it as an afterthought that can be handed off to somebody else, which I've also seen done. Like all of the ways that we try to avoid making sure we have the right people to work with, they're all going to come back and bite us.
Yeah, it's a great point. I've seen this tendency for people to try and minimize the effort for hiring. If your cup feels like it's already full, then you will feel like, okay, the only way I can make this balance is to minimize on the hiring. But if you're a CTO that is already stretching to try and cover the gaps in talent, actually the better way to tip some of it out of the cup is to bring in the right talent and get them up to speed. And so what I've often done is clear the plate, either defer some priorities, make time in the calendar for it, and make it my number one priority. Like actually look at the recruitment process as like, how can I make this the best possible recruitment process so that we can bring in the best possible people so that we've got the best possible help to actually help us go further.
There's this assumption that we have when we're hiring. It's one I hear about all the time. We treat it like a sales funnel, which again is a problematic metaphor, but it's very familiar. Right? We talk about let's bring in the highest number of people that we can find that meet the criteria that we're looking for, and then we'll filter them until we're down to the right number. And what we end up doing when that happens is we create things that are unnecessarily generic in order to encourage a wider talent pool to apply, under the assumption that's actually going to be helpful. And then it takes up our time and it takes up the candidate's time. Whereas I find a much more suitable metaphor is treat it like a pipe. The ideal number of candidates to apply for any one job is one. It's the right person applying at the right time for the right role. Everything above that is noise, which means the wider the talent pool is that you actually let into the funnel, the more work and the more waste you're creating. I want to think about it, and I want to encourage our audience to think about it as how much work can you do up front to minimize the number of wrong people that apply? So that's the starting point, because when someone reads a job description and has the right skills but gets turned off because they have the wrong culture, or vice versa, that's a win. You don't want people who don't fit in the organization to come, which means you don't want it to cost you a lot of time. You want to do it at a time when the commitment is low from both sides and the cost is low for getting it wrong.
Do you want to share some examples of what might be good?
One of the things that we did at my previous company, one of my previous companies when I was back in the UK, was we started by asking questions. So our job descriptions, so right out front, would start with, are these problems that you see? We were a tech consultancy, but our experience led us to believe and understand that actually there are no real tech problems. Everything is a people problem. So we were really upfront with that at the beginning. So do you realize or believe that the core of all technology problems is actually people and not tech? So right away, we're turning off everyone who's purely interested in technology. We're only getting people in who, yes, they want to work for a tech consultancy, they want to do technical work, but they know that's not enough. And so we would set up a number of questions that encouraged introspection before application. And that was the starting point. And so all of the people that we then had apply for jobs had already seen all of that. And we did still get some people who were just applying for every job under the sun, but we got a lot more, much better qualified candidates just from it opening with that starting point.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. And thinking more broad than the advertisement, if your company is regularly having conversations out in public,
Yep.
so we used to do it through running multiple blogs for the companies, by having regular events and things like that, being very intentional about sharing what's the culture like in the company, other things. For some people, those are going to be a turn on, and for other people, it'll be a turn off.
Yeah.
But the connection with people relevant for your company and the opportunities there may be increased as well.
So you're essentially being yourself out in the open so that people that resonate with that can actually find you.
Yeah. But that might include sharing some of your mistakes. And there's got to be a level of honesty, because there are a lot of companies out there sharing things, but they're sharing just the good news stories as well.
Yeah.
So on the talent front, maybe that's good, or maybe that sets a false impression and an expectation that won't be met. So I think because we've got a few questions coming through and I'm seeing some connections and some relationship, we might touch on those and then we might get through some more examples of what you're talking about, Noah. So let's start with Mark's question, because I've been pondering it whilst we've been talking. Mark is asking, to what extent do you think that strong labour protection laws in New Zealand drive these unintended outcomes? It's very hard to remove people from an organisation, and he says rightly, but that drives a level of fear and hence perfectionism that drives these multi-step interview processes. Would we be better off if the balance shifted? So do you want to start with that one, Noah?
I think it's a good question. I think it also assumes that the current process is the only way to do it. So I've worked in the US where there are pretty much no labor protections. I've worked in the UK where there are pretty strong labor protections. I've worked here where they're somewhere in between. And my experience is that recruiting works functionally the same in all three countries. We may or may not see some kind of subconscious influence and fear that drives multi-stage processes. But my experience is that most of those multi-stage processes are driven by copying what large companies in the US do, and they don't have any of those protections. And it's all based on the assumption that we have to funnel a huge number of people down to find the one right person. And that's the assumption I think is flawed. And so I think while New Zealand labor protection laws may contribute to some small degree, the vast majority of the kind of own goals we have in hiring have nothing to do with the labor protection laws. I think most people aren't even thinking about that when they go through the hiring process. I think they've got to do with the assumptions that we have about hiring and how people have to be hired and why they have to be hired. And we're, as humans, just not good at then closing the loop on how we're going to have to fire them at the other end if it comes to that.
I've seen one contributing factor to long multi-step hiring processes is disorganization. You might have a committee of people hiring, and they know these two people do this step and these two people do this step, but there's nothing connecting the different steps. And so for the candidate, you'll go through multiple rounds, you'll be asked the same question multiple times, and it's a very inefficient process. And on the hiring side, they can still go through many steps and realize they've not covered the questions they would need to actually make a hiring decision.
Yeah.
And that is a side effect of underinvesting in a holistic thinking of the hiring approach. You should never get to a step and not know what you're trying to answer by having that step. You could eliminate the step if you have a good framing for what it is.
It also has echoes of your talk earlier about local optimization. You want to have an architect talk to somebody. You want to have this person talk to somebody. You want to have this person talk to somebody. So each of those people then sets up their own interview process and figure out what questions they want to ask. And there's this missing overarching, what are we trying to achieve with interviewing for this role? Like what needs to be answered? What information do we have to have? Where are we trying to get to? And so I think we see quite a lot of that contributing.
I've hired in a bunch of different markets. I spent a lot of time hiring across various countries in Southeast Asia. I've been involved in hiring in the UK, hiring in the US, Australia, and New Zealand. The labour protection laws are different in all of them. I don't think it's what's driving these behaviors. It drives other behaviors around managing people, particularly with performance management within companies and things like that. I think there's a more fundamental issue with hiring that I'm seeing across all these companies. Should we switch through to, and by the way, Mark had a qualification to his previous question. Yes, even at will states in the US, there are crazy interview processes. Oh, so it's predicted. Cool. So let's shift to John's. So we've got some anecdotal experiences here. Do you want to read that one, Noah?
Sure. So John has said that his anecdotal experience is that he's applied for 63 roles since late July 2024. He's been ghosted 22 times, despite having an automated response that says we'll get back to you in anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks. Been rejected 24 times without a reason given, is given a general reason from 6, and was on several occasions has contacted and requested feedback and got personal feedback from 8 of them, 4 of which led to a telephone screen and 0 of which have led to an interview. It is a messy process in the market at the moment. It's hugely inefficient, and we're trying to find the right roles for the right people at the right time. So I guess, John, is there a question in there that you're asking for?
I'd say it's really good data. I've had quite a number of people reach out since mid last year with the down market to early this year. But I've had quite a number of people reaching out, and I'm supporting a few of them with some career coaching leading into CTO coaching. And their experiences very similar to what you're describing here, John. So I think it puts some data on those candidate experiences that you and I were describing earlier.
It does. Some of the alarming things that jump out to me is being ghosted. It's such a frustrating experience, particularly if you put in the effort to actually customize your CV or customize a cover letter and then never hear anything. If I were a hiring manager in that situation, I'd be pretty upset with how our process is working, because I think anyone who takes the time to apply for a role that we've advertised for deserves a response. And so actually we've done that at each of the last 5 companies I've worked for, made sure that every single person that applied for a job got a response. Sometimes the response was as simple as, we're not hiring out of country roles at the moment, so we're limited to a local pool, because we got a huge number of people from countries where they would have required visas or help to be able to work. But even though they're applying with 1 in a million chance, we wanted to make sure we got back to them and said, you know what? We looked at your CV, you're not qualified legally to work here, and we have candidates that are, so we have to go speak with them first.
Yeah, I've spent time working in HR tech over the last decade, including Seek and the Seek connected companies, and also local HR tech startup here called Weirdly. There was an example from China where to place ads, there's a credit system, and you can earn credits, which you can exchange for more ads by being a good global citizen as a company. It would include making sure that you're giving qualitative feedback along every step of the way for candidates and things like that. Now, I'm sure there was still probably some gaming of the system because the incentives are there. People do want ad credits so they can get more job ads out there. But by and large, we saw much shorter lead times for ads and a better overall sort of net promoter scores and things like that. So yeah, there's some really interesting stuff being done globally. And I also know for hiring of frontline roles, like working at supermarkets and things like that, a lot of the companies now are running like talent communities. Again, these are all like, they're encouraging a situation where people can ask for feedback about how they're going in the process and get feedback in a timely manner as well. I just don't know that a lot of these practices have hit tech in quite the same way. So it's quite interesting. So thank you very much for sharing that data, John. And he's qualified. Just wanted to give some numbers to the reality. And yeah, I think he's painted a great picture there.
And I think it's really interesting what different hiring practices, what impact slightly different hiring practices will have. So when I was probably about 20, 21, I hit the .com bust, right? I was made redundant along with almost everybody else around me and was then looking for work. I applied for a bunch of different roles without much luck. And the single best experience I had was going to a job fair, which there were quite a few of in those days, and went around to a whole bunch and handed in my CV on paper, because that's what you used to do back in the day. I ran into just a long queue of people who were waiting for the only hiring manager there. So one of the companies had actually had the hiring manager for the role they were looking for come to the job fair. And he spoke with everybody in that line, every single person. He listened to what they had to say. He asked them interesting questions. Like, he was the front line for actually interviewing people. At the end of that day, I got called in for a second interview. One other person got called in for a second interview. but he had spent one day and spoken with probably 50 or 100 different people. I ended up getting the job, but it's 20 years later and I still remember that hiring experience and very few of the others that I went through during
Hmm.
that time period. He came out and he cared and he wanted to spend time with people and he wanted to make sure he got the right person for the job. So he was just there talking to people who were looking for work.
I've got a similar but different experience, which I'll share. When I first moved to Malaysia, we were setting up a development center, and that meant there were hundreds of jobs already that could be advertised across multiple lines of business. So this was when I was working at Experian. So literally, you're like, there's 100 people working here, and it's going to be 300 over the next sort of 18 to 24 months. A strategy which is not often deployed in tech, although I think in Southeast Asia has these days more often been, is to do hiring days. A lot of frontline retail have used this strategy when they're opening new stores and they've got hundreds of roles. In tech, this was a pretty new concept then. If you've got hundreds of roles advertised, then you may have thousands of applicants coming through. But the good thing about a hiring day is that it's the opportunity to be seen. So people would go through. Now, there was still more people applying than available people to interview. So there was some sort of filtration going on. And what was used was like a multi choice test. And it wasn't trying to filter out the maximum number of people, it was really just trying to identify if there was just no relevance to the role.
Okay. Yep.
But pretty quickly, as soon as people had gone through that, the next step was immediately into interviews. And they might be 30 or 45-minute interviews. If during the course of an interview, you would find that there was maybe not readiness for the particular role or something like that, we'd spend the remaining 15 minutes giving feedback on what strengths they had, areas that they can invest in, and multiple times through that process, coming back 6 months later, 12 months later, demonstrating that they'd worked on areas of feedback and that they remembered, "Hey, you gave me this feedback. It gave me something really practical to work on. I've worked on it. Here's the evidence of me working on it." And yeah, some brilliant hires, people who joined my teams there and other teams at Experian went through those steps of getting feedback they could use.
We did something similar at Hyper. We wanted hiring to be something that people could walk away from knowing where they stood with the company. Right.
Mhm.
So we took a lot of the stuff that I'd done at previous companies and worked with several of the other people at Hyper who had really good ideas. One of the things we added that I really loved was we're not going to have a we'll get back to you later stage. And at the end of the interview, we're going to take 5 minutes to go away and have a conversation and say, what are the things that we liked? What are the things we didn't like? Where are the areas for improvement? And do we want to move forward? Then we get back in the room with the candidate right then and give them that feedback. And actually, we had really great conversations with people who were qualified and decided they wanted to carry on, and with people who weren't qualified, where they came back and they said, actually, that's really helpful. Really
Mhm.
appreciate you coming back and saying, these are the things that need to be worked on. These are the areas to
Mhm.
improve. It also gave them a chance to argue their point. We did actually have a couple of candidates where we had made a decision and we came back and we said, we don't think this is going to be a good fit for these reasons. And they'd come back and say, actually, we didn't get a chance to talk about this. Just do that now. And sometimes that would sway us and sometimes it wouldn't. But actually, the instant feedback was like really valuable. I'd encourage anyone who hasn't tried it to actually take the time to do it.
Yeah, it was similar with the hiring days. It's I'd say between 60 and 80% were hires, like offers made on the day. Yeah, which is it's just such a great experience. Committing the time for a hiring day where you might be on site for maybe 3 hours, but to know that you'll either get feedback that you can use or to actually walk away with a job offer in hand is a great experience. Also, great word of mouth as well. Also, hiring at that scale helped us identify a couple other things that when we'd been hiring back in Melbourne, where there was a much smaller talent pool at the time, there were lots of things that were either geared towards our convenience or inefficient, but we lived with it because there was only a small talent pool. That when demand got larger, became much more obvious. You'd have things like the last interview would be always the hardest interview. And that actually doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why wait 3 or 4 interviews in to then go, "Now here's the biggest hurdle." If there is a threshold or some dimension, that is essential to be successful in the role, then try and get that earlier, as early as possible in the process, both for manage people's expectations of what the role entails. Yeah. Yeah, lots of takeaways from that experience. I probably did 1,000 interviews whilst I was in Southeast Asia.
It's something that strikes me about those hiring days and the best experiences I've had that I mentioned earlier is the kind of minimal power differential. When you're hiring, there are some people who, when they're going through the process of looking for a job, they're desperate and they need the work. And there's this inherent power differential between the two things. And a lot of companies use that to their advantage. But one of the things that strikes me for this conversation is the amount of time that's being spent. And this is one of the ways that I measure power differentials and whether or not it's problematic is the amount of time being spent by their hiring manager and the amount of time being spent by the candidate should be the same. If you're going to ask them to come in for a day, then having you there for a day to actually go through and talk to people, that's on par. If you're going to ask them to come in for a day and you're putting in 20 minutes worth of work, that's not. You ask people to do a coding exercise where they're off spending 4 hours writing something up for you, and then you review it in 10 minutes. That's a massive power differential. And those are kinds of artificial hurdles that then leave a sour taste in people's mouth. The fact that all of my best experiences and what sound like a lot of your best experiences do away with that, whether it's conscious or unconscious, I think speaks volumes about the things that we should consider when we're actually hiring.
Yeah, and you are selling your company at the same time as they're selling to you as well, and to remember that and to use that. So that it's like you need to communicate about your company's principles and what it values and all of that. And you need to create opportunities for people to be able to ask questions about that and to dig in and ask you some hard questions and
Yeah.
see how you respond to them.
And to be honest about where you fail to meet them. That's had some of the best feedback I've ever had when hiring people or when trying to hire people is telling them these are the things we try to do. We recently fell down when we did it, or we're still struggling with it and we could use more help. Are you interested in giving us that kind of help? And just being honest with where the company is in terms of what it does and what it aspires to do. Like that makes a massive difference because as you said earlier in the episode, we're like, we're all flawed. The company's all flawed. Like you can't, if you project perfection, then you're going to mislead people and attract the wrong people.
Something that was amazing about recruiting in Malaysia was before Glassdoor, there were the forums. They're probably still thriving, but straight after a hiring day, you could go into the Lowyat forums and see the discussion about what was good, bad, or indifferent. And even if it was good, but interpreted because you didn't communicate it about it clearly or things like that, you would soon see. And yeah, I think that helped us to adjust things for the better. And you could see other companies getting the same feedback, but trying to fight it. I think they're just describing what they're feeling and what they experience. Yeah. So you talked about the power imbalance. I had one other anecdote from that era that was unintentionally leveled the playing field. So everyone was lined
Okay.
up. There was maybe 150 people lined up to grab their form and register and all that sort of stuff. And there was a coffee machine that was perpendicular to the line. So I go over and as the most senior person there, making a coffee for myself whilst everyone is lining up. And then somehow the machine is spraying hot water and steam and milk and everything all over me. And I turn around and there's 150 people like, oh, okay, yeah. And I'm wearing like the Experian red colored t-shirt. I've got the logo on the back and the front. So, hi guys, I'm the director of engineering here. Nice to meet you all. Does anyone know how to use this machine? Oh, go ahead, Noah.
So we've talked about where things could be and what people could do and approaches they could take. If you were on the side where you've done things the way everyone else has done them and you decided you wanted to adopt some of the things we've talked about, where would you start?
One of the places I'd start is getting a conversation with anyone who's invested in the hiring experience and
Okay.
having a conversation about what do we value, whether it's about this particular role or whether it's a group of roles. So trying to get on the same page. What is a singular view for what is a great employee look like? What does it look like when it
Okay.
goes wrong? Trying to synthesize that. So that I would start there, trying to get a picture of where we're heading. What about you?
So it's similar. I think it depends, in the case I'm thinking of, whether or not you work with recruiters. If you use recruiters, then one of the key things you're going to want to do is find a recruiting agency that, even if they don't necessarily agree with you, can behave as if they do. And
Mm,
so can think about, how do we minimize barriers? How do we write these job descriptions or these adverts in a way that actually encourages the right people to apply? How do we identify people in networks who will be a good fit based on all the criteria? If you don't use recruiters and you work with HR, you need to have a similar conversation. Otherwise, it's time to think about those things for yourself. How do you hire? How do you interview? What would be the least painful way as a candidate to be introduced to the realities of working in your company? Start with that question.
Do you want to give an example of what that might look like for that last point?
If you're a heavily bureaucratic, heavily regulated company that has things that are very difficult to deal with, then having a process that looks like that may not be the worst thing in the world, because at least people then know what they're getting into from the start. If you pride yourself on being able to deliver value rapidly, regardless of what that value looks like, then the question is, how do you allow your candidates to see that value as quickly as possible? And in fact, how do you get them to contribute? In the case of software developers or testers or other technical folks, one of the ways that I've seen do that works really well is just bring them in, pay them for a day of their time and get them to work with a team.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's literally nothing that's going to replace that experience on either side. You want to know, when you're looking for a job, whether you can work with the people that you're actually going to have to work with, whether you're going to be able to come up with good ideas, whether or not you're going to be able to play off each other. You'll be in conflict all the time, like some conflict obviously being healthy if it's the right sort, but some of it being really unhealthy. And everything that we do as as interviewers is a proxy for that. So the closer you can get to actually making that a reality, the better and more kind of reliable experience both parties will have.
Yeah. To expand on how that looks like from a practical sense, I guess maybe to meld it in with the idea I was sharing earlier. When you're thinking holistically about what is involved with the role, often you start with the JD. One of the things that I try and do with the JD is think very explicitly about what the outcomes are associated with the role.
Yeah.
And then ask for some feedback from the team of, hey, does this, because just your own view might be just skewed to particular perspectives. So you might have, who are the peers of this new hire, who are, if it's a managerial role, who might be working for that person. There might be other stakeholders within the business that they're going to be interacting with. So you try and get that sort of 360 view of the role. And then from all of that, you can start asking questions like, what would be the top 5 or 6 dimensions that we value most? So that if you do have a multi-step interview, each of the interviewers can be contributing to an answer on that. You could have a Likert scale, or I think we used to do a 10-point scale on some of those dimensions. They're like, maybe it's on the question of their leadership. So we're going to value their ability to lead or empower. Where do we think this candidate rates on that? So that you can have conversations across multiple interviews, if you have a multi-step process, which are consistent and are actually building up a picture that answers to that, rather than ending up in a step where you've asked a lot of questions, but you haven't made any progress towards an answer on whether to hire.
It's actually a really good point. When I was running a charity for consultants, we were bringing in kids without professional IT experience, and we were essentially expecting to teach them how to be consultants and get their first IT jobs. One of the things that we did was we came up with a list of criteria for what are the things that people will exhibit if they're going to be good hires for us. In our case, because they weren't going to have any professional experience, it was an interest in IT rather than documentable experience in IT. It was a willingness to admit their own ignorance. It was a drive for learning and a desire to really jump into things with both feet. And those were the things that then guided how we did the interview. And actually, I think if we hadn't taken the time to do that, and it's only kind of reflecting back on it, but if we hadn't taken the time to do that, we would have ended up with, I think, a much less suitable group of people that we brought in
Hmm.
for when we were working with them for the first time. So actually, it's a
Yeah.
really valuable technique you're talking about.
One other aspect is the level of capability that everyone has to bring to interviewing. So the actual process differs. And a call out to a colleague of mine, Norman Noble, who led the group hiring efforts at Seek, which involved training up people within Seek about interviewing good practices, all of those sorts of things, because we're not born with these skills. And he would lead cohorts of people and ensure that there was a capability level within the company. And these were other things that could contribute to a great candidate experience of going through the process and making sure that you had a great interview experience, regardless of which interviewer was there. That was another one. So we got to 5 minutes left. Is there other takeaways from earlier in the episode that you want to reiterate now, or that you think are particularly important?
I think if we just come back to treating an interview as a conversation between equals,
Hmm.
so that you're both trying to figure out, and as someone with the implied power, you want to encourage the people that you're hiring to ask questions about the company. So how do you approach your interview in a way that encourages that behavior?
Yeah, so to support that is almost signposting that. So, like when the interview starts, to say, "Hey, we're going to go through a few things, including space for you to ask questions about the company, so that they know about that."
Don't tell them they're going to have time to ask questions at the end.
Yeah.
Encourage questions all the way through the whole process.
Yeah, and getting it out there. So maybe before you've even started the interviews on your website, what to expect about a hiring process at said company.
Yeah.
All of those things can help bring the expectations and the power differential. Power distance working in Southeast Asia was a massive thing. There was not only the power of the company, but there was so many factors implying a longer distance power wise. So yeah, you have to do a lot of things to redress that balance to get a more productive interview. It cuts down on the people's nerves in interviews as well. There's so many things that you can do. So where can people find you, Noah?
So people can find me at noahcantor.com/coaching call. If you want to have a chat, if any of this resonated with you, you want to figure out how you can do this for yourself, then feel free to book a call with me. I'd love to talk to you. These are conversations that I really enjoy. They improve the lives of the people doing the hiring, they improve the lives of candidates, and that's why I do this.
Excellent. And you can catch me, Daniel Walters, at greatcto.me. So I am back to roughly 2 posts per week. So I'm doing one free post and one post for paid subscribers. Although I'll let you in on a little secret. The paid posts for subscribers are actually also published elsewhere for free. So you can find them there on the internet, but I'm providing them for the convenience of paid subscribers. So yeah, come check out greatcto.me. A paid subscription is there really just to support me continuing publishing that. But the reality is, I want the majority of that content out there for free because my mission is to help CTOs, as is Noah's. Until next time, thanks for watching another CTO Lifeline. See you later.